Hello, this is Laren with the Fantasy Grounds Academy. This is episode number 7 of the basic GM series. This will be the finale. I've essentially went over some of the basic elements that you'll need to use in Fantasy Grounds as far as setting up your games. The main thing is to lay out your table the same way every time if you can. The other thing is go through and make your own notes for each session. It makes it a lot easier to find things, so you're not going through and trying to unbury everything. Sometimes you can't do that if you're kind of running your game on the fly. I think a little bit of prep work goes a long ways, but if you're someone who just runs things as they happen, you can do that, but it's a little bit slower going. If you have a patient table and you kind of have a good routine doing that, there's nothing wrong with that. The other thing is kind of getting familiar with products and memorizing where some of the stuff is inside the interface. So up here on the far right, we have these categories. I'm going to expand the tab over here. So you have all the tools, which is mostly all GM stuff. I think the players can access the calendar, so that's not just for the GMs, and they can do some options in the actual settings. So there is an option here, the turn auto center map, which players can turn that off. So that way, when you're on a map and you have it all set up, you don't have to worry about it moving on you. That's pretty annoying. So when you're passing a turn in the combat tracker, the map will recenter, and that could really throw you off if you got everything laid out a certain way. So what I'm saying is, if you, let's say you're the rogue criminal, this character, I'm going to click on his entry in the combat tracker to select for his turn. We're in round 4. So if I go back to the options, by default, this is on, so turn auto center map on. Okay, so this is normally on for everyone that uses the table. It's not universal, so each person can set it for themselves. That way you don't have to rely on, just universal setting in this case. So what's happened here is now that it's his turn, when I hit the down arrow, the map will shift to the next actor or the next combatant on the map. So if I keep hitting the down arrow, the map is going to move to the next player. That's not so bad if you have the map zoomed out and you've got a lot of combatants and you're on a big map, because then you can kind of see what's going on. But if you're zoomed in, it can be real annoying. So if you don't want that, if you're the GM and you want just a specific area to be focused on, then you can come into the settings and you can turn that off so that when you do pass the turn, it's not going to shift the map around. So that's a helpful tip, just for in case you miss that in other content I've done. If you want to run this around a table, you can kind of do a hybrid mode. What I recommend is you actually use the platform as it is, and then once you get an idea of where everything is and how it works, then you can incorporate a workflow that will work for your group and your table, and you can start including the manual dice. You do that by coming into the options and go to dice manual entry, turn that on. So what happens is when you roll any sort of roll from a character sheet or an attack roll, so for instance a wolf, if I double click on the attack, it's going to bring up this dialog box. The player would roll the dice manually, tell me the number, so we'll say he rolled a 12. I'll go ahead and approve it, and it will do the calculation, or also record it in the chat window so you have a record of it. But essentially you're doing everything at that point, so it might slow you down a little bit, but you can use this as a hybrid and just take and put a whole nother instance of Fantasy Grounds on a different monitor and let the player see the map on there, and then you do everything behind the scenes. So there's that. There are some people who are able to play without anything. They just use the dice roller and the combat tracker. So it's really up to you how you want to run your table. But you can run it kind of in a hybrid mode. I think you can run it independently with just Theater of the Mind and not use any of this stuff, and just use this content like your library. So if you went into the actual library and you go to modules, whatever you have loaded, it was essentially just like your bookshelf. So whatever's in your bookshelf, you can pull that up. And let's say I click on Lost Mine of Phandelver module. If I click on this thing that says reference manual, this is the actual book. So if I want to run this as a adventure for my friends at the table and not be connected to anything or have any sort of digital component other than this library. I can run this just like just straight out of this reference manual and just use this as your library, and you take notes and stuff. So it's just a tool at this point. You won't even have anyone on the combat track or anything. You just use the library and the rules and such for your own advantage. So this is a way that you can use Fantasy Grounds if you were up camping and you didn't have a way to connect online. You can use this to run everything and, you know, pre-print out the character sheets and that kind of stuff. So kind of beats toting around a bunch of books and dice and such, but you have to have a little bit of dice. So anyways, there are a lot of good things that you can do with Fantasy Grounds regardless of the rule set. So a lot of the stuff I went over here was for D&D, but the same principles can be applied to just about any rule set, especially if it's like a core rule set like Pathfinder, Starfinder, any of those, fantasy-based Savage Worlds. Those are pretty much core-based. You start getting into like Vampire and some of the other rule sets that are independent. They're a little different. They're more story-driven, so there's nothing wrong with running those as a story mode in Theater of the Mind, because that's how those usually work anyway. So anyhow, if you don't need a tactical battle map and you're just running the adventure out of your library, that's essentially what this is good for as well. So you can run Fantasy Grounds completely online. You can kind of do a hybrid mode, and you can do it offline without any sort of connection or whatsoever. Now, if you're up in the woods, you're going to need a couple batteries, but other than that, this is pretty good. So this is the conclusion of this particular adventure for DMs. If you are new to Fantasy Grounds, my biggest tip is to use it. It's the best way to learn it. You're not going to walk in and just do it. You have to actually put a little time in to get familiar with where things are at. And a lot of these things aren't straightforward when you first start, but after you use them, it becomes second nature. So put your time in if you can and use the product, because that's how you're going to learn how to use it. It's the only way that I learned how. So, I mean, I'm not able to teach it unless I use it. So I use the game every other weekend, and just from that I learn stuff every time I pick it up and use it. So it's important that you put some time into it. There's a lot of people who, they'll put an hour into it and say, forget it. They don't want to put the effort into it. They just walk away because it's not, either it's not obvious to them, or they don't have content yet, or whatever the issue is. There's a lot of misconceptions that it's too hard or that it's very difficult to start. Well, yeah, it is when you first start, and it takes some practice and some getting used to before you're going to actually get it. Hey Jody. But that's essentially what you're going to go through when you're using Fantasy Grounds or any virtual tabletop with that. I went into some other forums. I was reading about some of the problems that people are having with other virtual tabletops, and it's essentially the same thing. There's no difference other than just this is better than that, and that's better than this, and you have some things that work better and some things that are a little bit more obvious, and then other things that are not. So depending on what you're investing in and what you want out of the game system is going to determine which platform you use for what. I notice a lot of people use Fantasy Grounds for D&D, and they'll use it for other systems that aren't available on other platforms, and vice versa. So if you play Warhammer or something, that might be in a different platform, and you'll use it for that. So there's nothing wrong with that. You don't have to put all your eggs in one basket. But as far as my own personal experience with Fantasy Grounds, it works pretty good. I've used Roll20. I thought it was okay as a player, but as a GM, I didn't really care for the interface and that sort of thing. But that's just how I was back then. I'm sure if I would have put my time in there, I would have got better at it, and maybe I wouldn't have turned away from it. But I just didn't feel like it was for me. So, but generally speaking, some tips that I want to give you from just parting words here is don't overload your modules. You don't need 50,000 modules. The only time you're going to need a lot of these is when you're building characters. When you're actually running the adventure, I mean, even this is a little excessive as far as I'm concerned. You really only need the module maybe the player's handbook, the setting book, you know, maybe the core book, and a couple supplements. You don't need every single book in your library. That really slows things down, and it puts a lot of overhead unnecessarily on your computer. The other thing is your combat tracker. If you have this thing stretch all the way out, and then you still have to scroll up and down on it, I think that's getting a little bit excessive in regards to navigating Fantasy Grounds and using it. Because when you have a party of 5 or 6 or 4 to 6, and then you got like 20,000 goblins on here, it takes a while for you to get this combat tracker to go through all the different entries. And what you'll notice is as you load it up, it gets very heavy, and because you have tokens that are tied into maps and that sort of thing. And that what's really slows things down is that you'll have too many entries on here. And what's too many? It's hard to say depending on your system and what you're doing, but I generally will take an encounter and break it up into waves or pieces if it's got like more than 10 combatants. Generally, if it's got 10, I'll break it up in half. What I'll do is I'll introduce the first wave, and then I'll do the second wave a few rounds later, so that if it's a big battle like that, you might want to try it in steps, because it's going to be really, really hard to maintain. And then you're constantly scrolling up and down through the combat tracker. It just very unwieldy after a while. So when you're running encounters, try not to run them like a mass combat. That's just way too much work, and it's very taxing on Fantasy Grounds and probably on your table. So that's something you want to keep in mind when you're learning how to play. Is that you want to keep your encounters down as possible. So, for instance, if I go to one of the encounters, let's see, I'm going to go to campaign, go to encounters. Don't think most of these have that many. I mean, it's not that very often that you're going to have that many creatures, but let's see, let's go to the orc camp. See, this is a pretty good size encounter. So this has a boss, some kind of minion. Let's see, Gog is he's a large giant. And then there's the orcs. So what I would do with this, honestly, is I would take and make my own version of this. So if I go to NPCs, or excuse me, if I go to encounters, and then I add my own encounter here at the bottom, what I'm going to end up doing is splitting this group up a little bit. So I definitely will take the giant Gog and put him on a separate encounter. That itself is a tough thing. That way I can bring him. He might come out a little later, or he might be the first to come out. That way, if the encounter's not going well, like if they're getting thumped by these orcs right off the bat, then you can slow the ogre down and introduce him later, or don't even bring him out at all if you don't want to. And then I might take Bruhor Axebiter and put him in a different encounter. So I'm just basically splitting the encounter up into pieces. That way it doesn't overload the combat tracker all at once. So I'm going to take Brugor and drag and drop him on here. And I'm going to grab a couple of the minions. So he'll have 2 bodyguards and then himself. And then I'm just going to adjust these. I'm going to adjust this down to 4. And then I'll get rid of these 2 because I already have them taken care of. So I'm just editing these by right-clicking and either deleting or just drag and dropping this little pin on the right-hand side to a blank encounter. So now I have separate encounters for each thing. So here's a CR2 encounter, CR2, CR2. Now this doesn't mean it's any less deadly because you're going to introduce them in waves, but it gives a little bit of opportunity for you to add them as you need. So if you got 4 or 5 players, I would throw these orcs out there first, just to kind of like shock troops. Then I would probably bring out the ogre. And then I would bring out the bodyguards, probably use missile weapons or spears or something, and use Brugor to kind of bolster their morale. And I'm going to see what he has on his stat block. So yeah, he has a javelin. And he's probably got more hit points. So you'd bring him out to clean house. Or you can do it in any order you want, but it keeps the combat tracker down to a minimum. So when you go and I'm going to add all of these at once. Now that I've added all those entries, it's pretty big. You know, it loads this thing up. This isn't too bad. This is probably about the max I'd want to do. So you've got, let's see, 4, and you got 7 and 8. So there's about 8 there. So my cap is about 10. Once you have 10 in an encounter and you get past that, it starts getting unwieldy. So as you can see, I'm already starting to have to scroll up and down. Not too much because it's not a huge encounter. But when you're having to do that during combat and when you're playing, it's a mess, and it could get really annoying really quick. So this would be if you had this thing super loaded and you're having to constantly scroll up and down on the combat tracker. That can be a little aggravating. So consider splitting them up if you can. You do that by unlocking the encounter, this little lock up here on top. Then you refresh the CR and the XP points. And then as far as the placement on the map goes, you know, you could bring that up and whatever map you're on and just pin them to the map wherever you want them to go. So I might just say this is the ogre, and then this is the boss and guardians. And I don't really think they're all going to be in the same spot anyways, so there's really no reason to put them in one location or in one encounter, simply only maybe just to save time. And then if you need a reference so you know what this goes to, you can always put in parentheses where this came from so that you're not confused. So if you split these up into 2 or 3 different encounters, you have this little reference here afterwards, and that'll give you a chance to figure out where you want to put them. And then as far as a map goes, so I'll just bring up any map here. So I'll bring up my session 1 notes. I'm pretty sure I had an image of the Sword Coast map, so I can bring that up just so I have it. Now this isn't a combat map, but I'm going to use this as just an example of how I would pin these. So if the players get to a certain point on the map and you want this to come out, so I would just drag and drop this pin into roughly the location where you want them to start. So that's the orcs for the camp. And then I'd place them by dragging them onto the map, just so I have them ready. So I'd have them in position or some sort of formation or whatever you want to do. And then close that. And once you do that, they disappear, but they are still already placed. The ogre, I would do the same thing. I would link it. Let's say he comes in back here, and then I'd take his token and drag it on there. And then I'd close it, and then it will close it on the map, but they're still placed, so you don't have to worry about it. And then these guys here, same thing. I'd pin those somewhere else on the map. Put Brugger out here, the boss, and his orc guards out here, for his minions or his guardians or bodyguards. And then, you know, call it a day. So it's a little bit more work there, but it saves you a ton of grief in the back end. So there's a lot of things you can do with Fantasy Grounds as you get familiar with it. You can customize things the way you want and make them more attractive to play, because it can get really annoying if you have all these things stacking up on you. It can get really unwieldy really quick. So just keep that in mind when you're running large encounters. The next thing is the characters. There's nothing that prevents the characters from editing their character sheets. Honestly, if you're worried about that, I don't know if I'd want to play with the people that are at the table. They can go in and modify the character sheets any way they like. You're hoping for the honor system, but if you really need to babysit people and keep track of them, you can always take a screenshot of their character sheet, especially the equipment and gold and such. And then also the actions tab, they can come in here and they can edit this stuff if they wanted to, or they can give themselves more arrows or whatever. So if you think that's an issue, you can always take screenshots. You can also export the characters in the state that they're in now and compare them later. But, you know, if you're having to do all that extra work, it's probably not worth playing with those individuals. But just to let you know, you cannot edit or, you know, control the character sheets. They are meant to be edited by the players and the DM. There's really not much you can do if they're, so to speak, cheating. And really, they're just cheating themselves. So when they do that, I don't really care. I just let it go. I don't sweat it. Unless they're obviously bragging about it, then I might say, hey, You know, don't do that again. Then if they keep doing it, then maybe kick them off the table. You ever have to kick someone off the table? You can right-click on their token if they're connected to your session, and there's a kick button that you can kick them off. And then you come over here to the chat window and you type in the word password with a space, and you put a different password on it, and you just let the new players know what the new password is. So next time he tries to come back in, he's not going to be able to join your table. So that's how you deal with an unruly player if that ever happens to you. I've only had to do that like once or twice in the 4 or 5 years that I've done this. So hopefully that's not you, but you can get disgruntled players occasionally that get pissed off and they just want to make things horrible for everyone else. The next thing is there is a lot of customization that can be done in Fantasy Grounds once you get a handle on it. Not covering that in the basics because there's a lot of extra stuff that goes along with this. But if you're interested, I have another series that has to do with converting module. And then later on in November 2nd, I'm going to be teaching another live course, which I will record. But essentially, I have a video series that I'm working on. I'm almost done with that. It's for converting a basic module. And then there's another thing that, you know, a class that I'm going to be doing in November with Frog God Games. So that's going to be a series and an event. And then I'm going to do a couple more, you know, like DM sessions, and that's basically leading up to FGCon. So if you're a new GM and you want some training, you can watch these videos, or you can join in the Fantasy Grounds Academy. I have events coming up, I think next week, or the 20th or something like that, for the GM series. I'm also doing a line of sight thing for maps, and then we're going to be training GMs for FGCon. I'm going to run a basic adventure or game at the end of FGCon on Sunday afternoon, which is on the Warhorn schedule. But nonetheless, that's what I got going on. But I just wanted to wrap the series up with a few tips and some reminders and such. So just remember to set your table up, put everything where you want it to go as you need it, and then make your little run list. One thing I failed to mention was if you use notes for your sessions and you want to use the same notes in a different session, if you're going to run it for a different player, you're going to have to transfer these over to story entry. So instead of putting them in a note, you put them in a story entry, which is basically the same thing. And the only difference is that the notes will not export. So if you're going to export your work, you want to put it in a story entry. I never intended to export this, so I just use it in the notes section. But if you want all these run notes that you're going to be using for the next 5 or 6 sessions, especially if you are going to run Adventure League or Organized Play, this would be very valuable. So instead of putting them in notes, make your own story entries and your own group. That way you can keep track of all your edits and those sort of things, and you can export those when you're done running the adventure, so you don't have to go through all this setup again, which is really handy. It'll cut down the amount of work that you have. But that's basically all I have. I didn't want to make this video too long. Leave comments on all the rest of the videos. If you go back to video 1, we can start off the series as GM basic series and kind of work all the way through. But your other things is, like, you know, get to know where your resources are. You can get supplemental content to help you with your games from the GM's Guild or the Fantasy Grounds Forge. Those are 2 good spots to get stuff for D&D at least. And then there are other avenues where you can get tokens and maps from patrons and those sort of things. But now you're getting into, you know, buying a bunch more stuff. But unfortunately, that's the burden of a GM. You can possibly get your players to donate once in a while, like set up a PayPal and have them donate to you. If they want to run something, you don't own it, and you might want to put that out there. But at any rate, thanks for watching, and this is the end of the basic GM series. This is episode number 7. If you've missed all the other ones, you can go back to episode 1. I have a playlist too, so if you want to go down the playlist, they're not too long. A couple of the videos are almost an hour. I think the combat one was one of those, but most of them are like, you know, between 20 and 30 minutes. Try to keep them kind of short and sweet. All right, folks, good luck. Have a great week, and hopefully you guys will be able to start running some games. And we'll look forward to seeing you at FGCon or around the community. And again, all the information for our server and the sort of thing